Hello, I'm Maria Georgopoulou, the director of the Gennadios Library, and it is my distinct pleasure to host today a webinar that is very much related to our new exhibition, an exhibition that opened last week, entitled The Free and the Brave, and it is about American Philhellenes and the glorious struggle of the Greeks. And today we have with us a wonderful scholar from Montana, and with a very Italian sounding name, Maureen Santelli, who has had a wonderful sort of academic path, starting with classics and history as an undergraduate at the University of Montana in Missoula. And then I guess she realized that there was something that could be explored more deeply with the relationship and the connection between classics, her love for Greece and Rome, and the history of the United States. So she moved to George Mason University, where she pursued her master's and PhD. And the fruit of this PhD is a wonderful study on the Greek War of Independence and within the context of the American history. Maureen has completed fellowships at George Washington's Mount Vernon, the Historical Society of Philadelphia, and the Library Company of Philadelphia. And she has also worked at the National Park Service as an interpreter and historian. And she's currently an associate professor at Northern Virginia Community College, where she teaches history, history of the United States, Western civilization, and world history courses. She has published an article with Early American Studies, Depart from that Retired Circle, Women's Support of the Greek War of Independence and Antebellum Reform. And her talk today will be based very much, I guess, on research that she has done about women's history and the women's movement in relation to the Greek War of Independence. But the fruit of the dissertation that I was talking about is a beautiful book entitled The Greek Fire, American-Ottoman Relations and Democratic Fervor in the Age of Revolutions. And she examines the rise of Philhellenism in the United States and how the movement of Philhellenism influenced both foreign and domestic policies during the early American Republic. Before I give the floor to Maureen, I wanted to remind you that, of course, we welcome questions, and we hope that we will have a lively discussion after the end at the completion of Maureen's lecture. I would like to ask you to place your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat, because it is somewhat hard for me to navigate both. We will try and we'll do our best to respond to most of the questions. That is our speaker and not I. But we truly look forward with Maureen's lecture tonight to really open discussion on different facets of American Philhellenism, not only on the volunteers who came to Greece and fought and died in Greece alongside the Greek warriors, but also these very wonderful and very much unknown events and waves and changes that happened both in Greece and the US. So tonight, the talk is entitled Philhellenism and the Development of Female-Led Reform in the United States. And I welcome Maureen Santelli to the podium, or the virtual podium. Welcome, Maureen.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here because I have images I'd like to share as I go. So again, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about this topic. In 1848, a young abolitionist by the name of Lucy Stone visited the Boston Common to view a controversial work of art that had all of Boston abuzz. The statue was the first nude sculpture of a woman put on exhibition in the United States, but its controversy extended well beyond this taboo. American artist Hiram Powers had created a work of art that depicted a young Greek Christian maiden recently enslaved by the Ottoman Turks, moments away from being placed on the auction block. Powers drew inspiration from the work, or for the work, from, quote, the Greek Revolution, the history of which is familiar to all. The Greek slave, whose family was destroyed by her foes, is now among barbarian strangers under the pressure of a full recollection of the calamitous events which have brought her to her present state, end quote. For Lucy Stone, however, the statue also evoked emotions within her for another reason. Upon seeing the statue, Stone was struck by how, quote, emblematic of women the statue was, with fettered hands and half-averted face. Stone recalled that in contemplating the meaning of the statue, quote, hot tears came to my eyes at the thought of millions of women who must be freed. For Stone, the Greek slave was an emotional and poignant reminder, not only of the status of women in war-torn Greece, but also of women in Stone's own country. Powers' masterpiece was a reminder of a popular movement that had brought together elite and middle-class women from countless benevolent, social, and religious groups of the 1820s. Female involvement in the Greek cause contributed to the expanding domestic sphere in antebellum America. This movement had enabled women with different charitable interests to band together for a common cause and find consensus in applying Republican motherhood and beneficence abroad. In addition, the Greek Revolution made an impression on future political rhetoric in the United States, influencing, for example, and this is the focus of my talk, the abolitionist and women's rights movements. And I'm going to say a little bit more about what exactly the benevolence movement was and what this meant for women. But just really quickly, the image up here on your screen. So this is an engraving, the Independent Benevolent Society of Philadelphia, established in 1811. And this is something I'm going to be touching quite a lot on today. So first of all, we have to understand that American society of the early 19th century was very conservative. And when I said, I mentioned Republican motherhood and the benevolence movement, women were expected to remain within what historians have called the so-called domestic sphere. So women's work really had to only concern the home. So looking after children, etc. Now they could extend their influence outside of the home, but only if it concerned issues that related to the so-called domestic sphere. So helping out other people's children or other mothers, etc. And so the focus of my talk today is to discuss not only how women came to extend themselves outside of the home and entered into more of a political arena via these avenues of charity, but also more specifically, how the Philhellenic movement actually helped to facilitate their movement outside of the home. Before organized benevolence in the United States embraced the cause, the Greek Revolution was closely linked to the international Philhellenic movement. This was an intellectual trend that looked back to ancient Greece as the source of Western democracy and freedom. Americans felt they shared the plight of the modern Greeks, more so than European Philhellenes because they had fought and won their own revolution. In addition, a dislike and mistrust for the Muslim world was already extant within the United States by the end of the 18th century, but had intensified through the Barbary Wars. So we have to understand that at the beginning of the 1820s, the United States has already fought this war with the Barbary states. There's this sort of long-standing mistrust for the Muslim world, for Islam in particular, and the Barbary Wars, as well as American experience in that conflict, also a popular genre of literature known as captivity tales, which talked about the enslavement of whites by Barbary pirates. This has shaped the perspective that Americans are going to have towards the Ottoman Empire. And in a lot of cases, it's their perspective is not totally correct, but as I'm going to discuss, that's not necessarily important. What's important is understanding the perspective that Americans had at this time, because that's what's going to shape their perspectives towards the Greek Revolution. The nostalgic connection to ancient Greece, combined with the fact that the modern Greeks were living under Ottoman rule, cultivated early American interest in advocating for Greek independence and the restoration of a Greece that more resembled its ancient political origins. 19th century female-centered benevolent societies focused on a range of charitable efforts. Benevolent societies were popular among white elite and middle-class Protestant women. Remember, these are women that actually have the time to devote their services to such things. And we see these organizations in both northern and southern states, where dedication to Christianity and family justified participation in the civic and political affairs of local communities. So again, it's taboo for women to be involved in politics. They're not supposed to speak about politics, but if it has to concern domestic issues, then it's sort of okay. Okay, and again, we're gonna see this develop. Enthusiasm for ancient Greece entwined with the dedication to the Greek cause as part of a global outreach for social and religious reform. Female interest in Greece coincided with providing aid for destitute mothers, their children, Protestant evangelism, and education. The early organization of the Philhellenic movement in the United States was largely achieved through the efforts of two individuals: classical Harvard scholar Edward Everett and Philadelphia printer and philanthropist Matthew Carey. By the way, whenever I try to do images for these presentations, I try to make the images reflect the individual at the moment that I'm speaking about them. Unfortunately, Edward Everett we don't have an image of him as a young man. So bear in mind that Edward Everett did not look like this when he's involved in the support for the Greek Revolution. He is a young man just sort of coming into his own. He's not yet famous, but arguably his involvement in the Greek cause in the United States sort of catapults him to national notoriety. Matthew Carey was a little bit older at this time, and again, I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. While these two men were internationally recognized for their support for the Greek Revolution, both relied on the involvement of women. Women directed their efforts toward gathering supplies, clothes, and later organized efforts to recruit teachers for newly built schools in Athens. A key reason that American women were especially drawn to the Greek cause and saw it as an extension of their existing charitable work was through their understanding of female life in the Ottoman Empire. For early Americans who saw the moral stability of a nation as originating in the home with the wife and mother, the harem was viewed as the ultimate manifestation of depravity and despotism. Now, this image is not one that would have been known in the United States in the 1820s. This is a much later, it's later 19th century, but it does reflect the attitude that Americans had towards the Turks and the harem in particular, okay? So this image is obviously supposed to elicit sympathy for these young women and the situation that they're in. Again, their understanding of the harem was not completely accurate, but again, their conservative society combined with their understanding of the Ottomans and Islam, has shaped this perspective. Most Americans believed that women in these harems were literally locked up within the Sultan's palace and kept for his every erotic whim. Early advocates for women's rights, most notably Mary Wollstonecraft, frequently referred to the status of women in Islamic culture as one of complete exploitation that, quote, kills virtue and genius in the bud. According to Wollstonecraft, if women could not pursue reason and respect within society, then they would be condemned to the same kind of subjective status as Muslim women. When the United States government refused to officially assist Greece, female-led groups organized efforts at the local level to raise funds for Greek civilians. Conservatively, women helped to raise tens of thousands of dollars and perhaps more for the Greek cause. Funds were raised in a variety of ways, including knocking on doors, advertising in newspapers, speeches, which women would have had to have sponsored. It wouldn't have been socially acceptable for women to give the speeches themselves, but they would have hired somebody or asked somebody to speak about it, and this person would have been, of course, a male Philhellene. They also organized carnivals, balls. For the socially conservative American society, female Philhellenes could not give these speeches themselves on the subject of the Greek cause, but nonetheless, women were often the chief organizers of these fundraising events. Although much of the more active organizations existed in northern cities, activity also took place throughout southern communities. This image that I have up here is just one example. I mean, I could flood your screen with literally hundreds upon hundreds of similar articles like this, but I thought it would be fun to at least show you one of these. Newspapers were the major means of communication of the organization of the Philhellenic movement. You know, obviously long predating social media and that sort of thing. So this is how they're mobilizing efforts. And in a lot of cases, women are actually in a sort of way communicating with one another to different communities through these ads. So again, this is just one of many, many, many showing female leadership and involvement in the Greek cause. Female support for the Greek Revolution accelerated in response to a series of setbacks sustained by the Greek army. The death of Lord Byron at the Greek-controlled city of Missolonghi in April of 1824 especially piqued interest. Newspapers reported that the Greek Fund of New York alone successfully dispatched a contribution in the amount of $6,000 in the early summer. Again, that's just one contribution. And that 5,000 more had been gathered by August, so just a few months later. Public interest only continued to accelerate in the midst of what would become known as the Greek Frigate scandal, an incident that involved a New York shipbuilding company that mismanaged the construction of 2 ships for the Greek Navy. Philhellenes considered it a national embarrassment that this incident might have added to the suffering of the Greek army and civilians. So we start to see a regenerated interest in trying to gather supplies, clothing, food, etc., to send it to Greece. And again, women are going to be at the forefront of doing this because it's an extension of that domestic sphere. By the height of female involvement in the Greek cause, ladies' groups primarily directed their efforts at gathering food and clothing for Greek civilians. And why? Because this is going to be appropriate for them, right? It's not going to be necessarily appropriate for them to raise funds for guns, right, or ammunition, but it's completely acceptable for them to concern themselves with the welfare of Greek civilians. The ladies of Providence, Rhode Island, and surrounding communities alone produced over 3,000 items of clothing. Greek committees reported similar efforts in numerous towns and cities. Even in smaller communities such as Canandaigua, New York, so this is just a little teeny tiny town, local ladies set to work with, quote, their needles in making clothing for Greek women and children. There's actually a really cute story, and I could not find it. I wanted to put it up here for you all to see, but there's a story about these women, and they bring their children to the sewing circle to produce all this clothing for Greek civilians. And one woman is interviewed, in reflecting on why she decided to spend all this time making clothing for people that she's never going to meet, right? Like what's her motivation? And they just felt so connected with these Greek mothers and what they're going through. They, of course, are hearing stories about war-torn Greece. And this one mother in particular reflects on looking at the face of her own child and thinking about children in Greece and what they're going through. And this is why she's there and spending all this time sewing these clothes. At least some African-American women were involved in the Greek cause, since one paper reported that, quote, ladies and gentlemen of color in New York had given a benefit for the Greek cause. According to the report, the participants were so enthusiastic that the company did not disperse until 6 in the morning. And unfortunately, I was not able to find more information about that event, but it shows that there is this widespread interest throughout the United States to support the Greeks. And again, it's especially felt by women across the board. Newspapers and pamphlets publicized female efforts at raising funds and supplies, simultaneously providing local news of charity efforts, as well as advertising for Greek aid. These reports also showed that female organizations from different localities made active attempts to coordinate efforts. A newspaper in Hartford, Connecticut described how women were actively engaging their sympathies in behalf of the suffering Greeks. Addressing ladies of neighboring towns, the piece asserted, "We shall be pardoned for intimating the practicability of a cooperating exertion, as their intercourse with Hartford or with New York would open to them and to us a common channel of communication with Greece." So it's not just that these individual communities want to raise funds, but they recognize that by mobilizing efforts with other communities, it's going to be more effective. In Boston, a meeting of ladies was so large that its members had to relocate to a larger meeting hall. With the meeting now in a nearby church, the building was quickly filled with ladies who appeared to be strongly interested in the subject of the meeting. Surveying the women's efforts, one newspaper announced in 1827, in other states, individuals, religious and Masonic societies, corporations, etc., have all contributed their aid in various forms, and the ladies have enthusiastically exerted themselves in the same noble cause. So again, acknowledging that women are just as equally mobilizing efforts as the men. The language used to report female efforts at fundraising or recruitment linked charitable outreach in Greece with benevolence, and they intentionally do this to, again, make it an appropriate cause for women to be involved in. In one of the Philadelphia committee's printed addresses to the public, 2 examples of organized female support provided evidence of successful donation collections in other parts of the country. The examples provided were committees in Buffalo, New York, and Baltimore, Maryland. In Buffalo, the ladies were, quote, respectfully invited to solicit donations in order that the suffering mothers and daughters of Greece will find zealous friends and able advocates among the sex who proverbially lend a grace to deeds of charity while they borrow a charm from exercise of its duties. In Baltimore, ladies did not wait to be invited to assist with the cause, and this is sort of maybe slightly radical in that women are not invited to become involved. They actually just decide, no, we're going to do this. But rather, the women formed their own organization for the purpose of devising measures to assist as far as may be in their power. A resolution from Baltimore stated that it was the duty of the ladies of the United States to, quote, and I love this quote, it's a quote from a title of my article, depart from that retired circle in which a judicious state of society requires the ladies of this country usually move, and use the influence which is allotted them in relieving from starvation the suffering females of a foreign land, whose sons and husbands are fighting the battles of the cross against the crescent. The Greek cause gave American women permission to become more publicly active. Among the successes of this Baltimore-based Relief Society was a ladies' fair, which raised $1,700 for the cause. Now, again, I realize that some of the numbers I'm mentioning don't seem like a lot to us, but again, remember, this is the 1820s. $1,700 from just one event is very significant. In fact, one article written on the success of the Ladies' Fair, it pointed out that the women of Baltimore had far outdone their male counterparts and that the men should be ashamed of their lethargy. So again, the expectation is, men, you're supposed to be out in public doing this stuff, but here the women have actually outshined you. And you'll also notice that the women are not criticized for this because, again, this is an appropriate extension of their interests from the home. A few Greeks who came to the United States as refugees also lauded the support provided by American women. For example, Samuel Gridley Howe, American Philhellene and doctor, and I'm sure an individual that you all are familiar with, brought a young boy by the name of Christophoros Plato Castanis home with him in the United States. A Boston Ladies Association at Amherst provided Castanis with an education. He became a well-respected orator, primarily speaking on the subject of Greece. In a memoir he wrote as an adult, and this is the title page from that memoir, Castanis detailed his life in Greece and his experiences in the Greek War. He especially acknowledged American women as being particular patrons of Greece, dedicating the memoir to the ladies of America. Castanis expressed his gratitude for female Philhellenic efforts, requesting that they, quote, accept this work as a token of the love and gratitude of the matrons and maidens who, through yourselves, have taught the heart of Greece to beat in response to the heart of Columbia. Another Greek refugee by the name of Joseph Stefanini, who wrote a history of the Greek Revolution, came to the United States after escaping from Turkish servitude. Stefanini's purpose of writing and publishing a history of the war was to, quote, enable him to return to his own country and to release from slavery a large and suffering family. Published in 1829, Stefanini concluded by thanking the people who had assisted him in the life in America, especially the ladies who have so kindly interested themselves to obtain subscriptions for my work. My most sincere and respectful thanks are due. Female aid societies provided support for Castanis and Stefanini, each acknowledging the singular efforts of women on behalf of the Greeks. With this in mind, both men spoke about the need for American education efforts in Greece, calling on American women to support that cause. Castanis captured the desire to educate the Greeks in his memoir, observing, quote, just as primeval Cretans nourished and educated infant Jove upon Mount Ida, so the strong and refined arm of American philanthropy fed, clothed, and educated many an infant descendant of those godlike fathers of the Grecian race. Such observations encouraged Stefanini and Castanis to regard American women as the special patrons of Greece's women and children. Indeed, education in Greece would prove to be one important way in which women continued to exert influence in Greece even after the revolution was at an end. With enthusiasm for the welfare of modern Greek women at an apex, women began to diversify their relief efforts, and they respond to this interest in helping to establish schools in Greece. With the combined cooperation of Philhellenic ladies, organizations, and missionaries, the first American-run schools in Greece were established in 1828. Education efforts in Greece were focused on moving, quote, towards the emancipation of the minds of Greece from their long bondage, and again referencing the rule under the Ottoman Turks. Missionaries worked in conjunction with the Ladies' Greek Committee of New York, as well as individuals such as the founder of the first female institution for higher learning in the United States, Emma Willard. Willard wrote a letter to the New York State Legislature in 1819, stating how a nation educated its women was a reflection of how civilized the society was as a whole. From an American perspective, the Ottoman Empire was not civilized And therefore, in order for the Greeks to become a free nation, education was key. And here we have Emma Willard here on the left. And then I'll speak a little bit more about the woman on the right. This is her sister, Elmira Phelps. Now, Emma Willard was a strong advocate for female education in the United States. She did not go so far as to make radical statements about like equality of the sexes or even abolitionism, but her sister was more radical. And while obviously just because your sister is more radical than you are, Emma Willard certainly was exposed to these ideas and would have been familiar with them. So I just thought I should mention that. In the midst of their reform efforts in Greece, advocates for female education reform could not help but see similar issues in their own country, where both white women and slaves were denied access to education as well. In 1833, Willard's sister, Elmira Phelps, again, the lady on the right, compared those who denied education to women to Southern slaveholders, pointing out that a bill for the endowment of a female seminary was defeated, and this is in the United States. So again, their efforts are at mobilizing, building schools dedicated for the education of women, and they're hitting some road bumps. This bill was defeated by those who thought, quote, of the evils which might result from the enlightening of the minds of those who were destined to a limited and subordinate sphere. Applying her thoughts of education as being the ultimate method of enlightening any group of people, Phelps observed that, quote, as respects the slave, this reasoning is undoubtedly correct. Let the Black population of the South be taught that they in fact possess the greater physical power. Let their minds be open to the truths of man's equality by nature and of the unjust tenure of their bondage. In a similar way, Willard wrote in the same year that female education in Greece was important, given that the Greek women had been slaves under Turkish rule for so long that they needed, quote, others to resuscitate the principle of life within her. When this is once effected, she will walk abroad in her own strength and provide for herself and for her children. So I want to take note of something really quickly here. This is a bit of a radical departure from just raising supplies and funds for civilians, right? This is venturing maybe a little too outside of the domestic sphere, but they are still trying to use the domestic sphere to justify their ability to speak on these issues. So the idea of Republican motherhood, the idea is it's important for women to have some semblance of an education because Republican mothers will educate the next generation of public servants. Everyone's first teacher is your mother, right? Or so the understanding of the time went. So why should women not be given a formal education then? This can only benefit the American Republic. Now, Willard doesn't publicly go as far as her sister, but Elmira Phelps is using that argument to expand beyond just talking about education for women, which again, we have to acknowledge is radical at this time. She's using that argument to extend that into discussing abolitionism, which is even more radical in the late 1820s and 1830s. Supported by other local women, Willard created a charitable society focused on building schools for Greek girls that they named the Troy Society for the Advancement of Female Education in Greece. Willard enjoyed support from a number of individuals that advocated for female education, including, again, Samuel Gridley Howe and Sarah Buell Hale, editor of the Ladies Magazine and Literary Gazette. Again, Sarah Buell Hale is kind of on the same level as Emma Willard. She's a strong advocate for female education. She's not necessarily willing to go so far as to openly discuss equality of the sexes. So she's not quite as radical as other women at this time. She's not necessarily talking about abolitionism either, like Elmira Phelps, but she is advocating for this expanded presence for women in education. And fun fact, she's also credited for writing Mary Had a Little Lamb. By 1835, Through the cooperative efforts of the Greek government and American Greek aid societies, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions had established several schools, providing education to hundreds of male and female students. Almost 15 years later, the rhetoric used by these Greek aid societies played a part in the emerging abolitionist and women's rights movements that followed in the preceding decades. And again, this is kind of the basis of one of my arguments in my book, the idea that these movements have frequently been discussed by American scholars as being purely just domestic issues, that they aren't really connected with the perspectives Americans had on international affairs. And so what I try to do is to discuss that in order to fully understand their perspectives, we have to understand that they were aware of a global conception of these ideas, and more specifically, that the Greek Revolution actually did play an important part in the development of these ideas. Hiram Power's Greek Slave illustrates this phenomenon, the use of the Greek cause rhetoric in the extension of these movements. The Greek slave reminded many of the support they provided during the Greek Revolution, their disdain for Turkish slavery, and the status of women abroad. The statue itself embodied the vision of the ideal chaste female, modest, demure, and in need of protection. So again, this is that more conservative perspective of women's place. Again, the idea that women is supposed to be demure, submissive, not that they're, the Greek slave's ready to pick a fight with whoever's about to put her on the auction block, right? That she is a virtuous individual who is suffering at the hands of the Turks. And I'll come back to that point in just a little bit. The slave represented all of the Greek women whom the ladies' aid societies wanted to help with their donations of clothing and funding. For American women, this image of Greek slavery and Turkish oppression also contributed to the conversations on the persistence of female oppression at home. Abolitionists saw the Greek slave as an image that highlighted the degree to which the United States fell short of its own ideals. And before I move to the next slide, just really briefly, this image is an engraving of the Greek slave on display at a gallery in New York City. What's interesting about this image is not just that it shows the gallery room that the statue's in, but that she is being viewed by mixed company. Again, remember, this is the first nude statue ever to be put on public display in the United States. It is radical that this nude statue is being put on display. So how is it considered to be appropriate then? And not only that, but appropriate for women and children, which you'll see there's the little girl down at the front there. Why is this appropriate? Because again, the subject matter harkens back to the Greek cause, to the Greek Revolution, something that people still would have been familiar with, that they were devoted to this idea of freeing Greece from the Ottomans, and also that morally, you're supposed to feel this sort of connection with this poor young Greek woman who is being put on the auction block. So it's supposed to elicit extreme sympathy for this young woman, of course. Frederick Douglass's paper captured this sentiment best in terms of the Greek slave as being a representation of how far short the United States falls to its ideals as expressed in the Declaration of Independence. And by the way, this is a photograph taken of Douglass in 1847. So this is what he would have looked like when the Greek slave was put on display and when these articles are being written. So the Frederick Douglass's paper writes this review about the statue, and this review, I think, really says it best. And it offers this emotional reaction to seeing this innocent young girl in chains. Quote, "How heart and brain burn with hatred for the cruel Turk who does thus violate the sacred rights of human nature. And to this feeling heart and discerning eye, all slave Greek girls are Greek, and all slave mongers Turks. Wicked, cruel, and hateful be their names. Their country, Algiers or Alabama, Congo or Carolina, the same. Many other abolitionist publications drew similar conclusions, hoping the Greek slaves tour, and she traveled throughout the North as well as the South, being viewed by hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans. And abolitionists hoped that her tour would bring about a national awakening to the similarities between slavery in the Ottoman Empire and the United States. Abolitionists hoped that the Southern slaveholders, upon gazing upon the Greek slave, would suddenly reject slavery as practiced in the United States. And so we have to also then understand that, for example, Lucy Stone, this young woman who goes to see the Greek slave, this is what she has in her mind as she's viewing this statue. For American women especially, the Greek slave resonated with their own legal status. The image of the slave as a symbol of lost personhood was especially powerful for women in the antebellum era, as it represented to them a lack of legal control over their bodies. That the Greek slave depicted a nude Christian female with no control over her sexuality, let alone her future, was an association not lost on American women. For example, the Greek slave had inspired Lucy Stone to not only continue her efforts at ending slavery, but it also influenced her to advocate for women's issues. In fact, Lucy Stone, and that's where I began my talk, where she was so struck by the statue, and she almost describes it as almost like a conversion moment in seeing the Greek slave. She goes from just speaking about abolitionism, which again, although radical, a lot of women were engaging in it, and it again sort of as an extension of the domestic sphere. These individuals enslaved within our own country need female assistance. But in seeing the Greek slave, she decides that she's going to also speak about women's rights, which again was considered to be a lot more radical at the time. So immediately afterwards, she started to speak not just on abolitionism, but women's rights. And in fact, event organizers were not happy with her for talking about women's rights. And they said, basically, we invited you to talk about abolitionism, don't be talking about women's rights. And she says, listen, if you want me to speak, I'm gonna talk about both. So either I talk about both or you're just not gonna have me. So, and again, the Greek slave elicits that conversion for her. Stone and other like-minded women also used the Greek slave and the rhetoric made popular during the Greek Revolution as a vehicle for more radical political statements. A contemporary of Hiram Powers was Harriet Hosmer, an American female sculptor that endeavored to convey a message of anti-slavery as well as women's rights issues through her art. So I'm going to talk about, again, this understanding of the Greek slave, the Philhellenic movement, is going to be used as a means to once again transform how women are trying to articulate their attitudes towards women's rights. So here we have, again, the Greek slave. She is sort of very reluctantly accepting her future. She's demurely looking down. She, although nude, is sort of cloaked in her virginity, and just the fact that she's completely being held in the situation against her will. In detail, over here on the left, Hiram Powers has shown that she is Christian. We have the cross. If you follow down from her thumb, we see the symbol of the cross. So again, she's Christian, she's a virgin, absolutely deserving of sympathy, and sort of trying to elicit this idea that something needs to be done to help this individual. So Harriet Hosmer wants to turn that argument on its head a little bit in her art. As Hosmer's notoriety as a female artist rose, she attracted the attention of female abolitionists and women's rights advocates, including Lydia Maria Child, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the poet, Frances Dana Barker, as well as Lucy Stone. Only in her early 20s at the time, Hosmer produced an artistic critique of Powers' Greek slave. Hosmer, with the encouragement of both Child and Stone, She endeavored to produce a statue of a woman that, unlike the Greek slave, would depict a strong woman that reflected resolute defiance toward her male captors. Hosmer's statue depicted Zenobia, the queen of the Greek kingdom Palmyra, who was enslaved by the Romans in 274 CE. For Hosmer and the women's rights advocates who supported her work, Zenobia in chains represented a more aggressive and publicly visible approach to women's reform. So again, it's nuanced, but I'm going to discuss a little bit more. They're trying to make this argument that women's rights is something that women need to more aggressively embrace, that women should not be just respected because, oh, we're virginal or that we're chaste, but that women are deserving as a right to be given these rights on the same level as men. With Power's Greek slave as inspiration and motivation, Hosmer diligently gathered the advice of her female supporters and created a statue that combined women's rights and abolitionism. One of Hosmer's most famous supporters was English poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who wrote a poem about the Greek slave while it was on display at the Crystal Palace in London. In her poem, Browning criticized the paradoxical placidness of Power's statue, but reminded her readers that the Greek slave's message was not merely of Turkish oppression, but a reminder of the existence of oppression in their own country. Browning's criticism of Power's statue as being too passive likely influenced Hosmer. Lydia Maria Child also suggested that Hosmer's statue portray a strong rather than weak woman. Child wrote many reviews of Hosmer's work, praising her artistic abilities as a female artist. Child's review of Zenobia in Chains highlighted its differences from Power's statue. Quote, "The expression of the beautiful face is admirably conceived. It is sad, but calm and very proud. The expression of a great soul whose regal majesty no misfortune could dethrone." Like Browning, Child disagreed with Power's depiction of a subdued, weak, and demure woman, and preferred that such a female figure should stand resolute and determined. Hosmer wrote Child specifically addressing this aspect of the statue, explaining, quote, "I have tried to make her too proud to exhibit passion or emotion of any kind, not subdued, though a prisoner, but calm, grand, and strong within herself." Where Power's statue represented a Philhellenic and abolitionist icon with a powerless woman in need of rescue, Hosmer's statue represented the aspirations of the women's rights movement. For the women who collaborated on Zenobia, the symbol of women's rights would not passively accept subjugation and slavery like Power's Greek slave, but rather should defy it. The more radical feminists of the time translated this critique into fashion. Excuse me. So, and actually before I move on, just really quickly to show these images, and it looks like my one on the right's a little pixelated, so I'm sorry about that. So again, it's a critique about slavery. So we have to understand that that's part of the conversation, that slavery anywhere at any time is wrong. But then we also have that element of the woman here. So rather than being demure and, oh, I'm in need of rescue, for Hosmer and these other women's rights advocates of the mid-19th century, they are trying to make the statement that women need to not be demure, that they need to embrace more of an active effort at getting some more rights than what they already have. And that argument is very radical. Again, in understanding that historical context where women are supposed to be within that domestic sphere. They're not supposed to be departing from that domestic sphere, right? But again, these influences, including the Greek cause that have allowed for women to exit out of the domestic sphere, they're trying to argue we don't have to go back in to that sphere just because we're no longer organizing aid for some cause, but that it's our right to be out and to concern ourselves with our own rights and the rights of others. So again, the more radical feminists of the time translated this critique into fashion. An easily recognized symbol of Eastern exoticism in 19th century America was the so-called Turkish trousers. Basically, what we're going to see with this is the Turkish trousers are going to turn the despotic Turkish paradigm on its head, and it's going to come to represent the pursuit of female freedom rather than its oppression. Americans would have become familiar with the so-called Turkish trousers, and again, that's what they were called, from Western travelers to the East and through printed images. During the Greek Revolution, this style of dress would have been recognizable from illustrations, including this front piece of the Song of the Greek Amazon. It's a musical score by Elam Ives Jr. And just really quickly, the Song of the Greek Amazon was a popular poem written by William Cullen Bryant, who was a famous American poet, promoted by such authors like James Fenimore Cooper and others. So very well known. He wrote this poem and others expressing support and solidarity with the Greeks at the time of the Greek Revolution. And this poem was so popular that it's set to music. So this likely dates to around 1830, although there isn't actually a date listed. And here we have the so-called Greek Amazon depicted here on the front piece of the music. I've set to music this popular poem, which tells the story of a young Greek maiden whose betrothed had been killed in battle by the Turks. Rather than merely grieve her loss, the maiden took matters into her own hands by shedding her femininity and became a Greek cleft. Excuse me. Sorry. A Greek independence fighter. The violence the young woman intended to embrace, as she declared, and this is from the poem, "I buckle to my slender side the pistol and the scimitar, and in my maiden flower and pride am come to share the tasks of war." This was justified because of the injustice she had suffered at the hands of the Turks. So dressed in the so-called Turkish costume, a style of dress also found in Greece, the Greek Amazon was depicted making this vow on the cover of the musical setting of the poem. 3 years after Hiram Power's Greek Slave made its tour through the United States, women's rights advocates promoted a new style of fashion based on this and was driven towards displacing social restrictions on women. Named after Amelia Jenks Bloomer, who first wore the fashion in the United States. And Amelia Jenks Bloomer, by the way, is an advocate for women's rights as well as abolitionism, and she absolutely would have been considered a radical in her time. The so-called Bloomer costume, taken from her name, was a fashion sensation in the 1850s, with newspapers reporting throughout the country a multitude of sightings of women wearing them. The costume was inspired by, again, these Turkish trousers with a shorter skirt placed over pantaloons. Quote, "It's of the same materials as the dress and extending from the waist to the instep, and is gathered around the ankle and allowed to fall over the gaiter." The gaiter is the shoe. Worn and discussed by women and the American public from New York to Texas. And it's printed in newspapers throughout this time period, people like writing, and it's meant to be, it's sort of shocking, right? So if anyone sees a woman wearing this, it made it into the paper. The Bloomer costume was viewed as a welcome alternative by radical women to the whalebone corsets, with yards of fabric composing the necessary petticoats and skirts typically worn by women of the 19th century. This was not the first time Turkish-inspired trousers were adopted by women as a symbol of female independence. The use of Turkish trousers can be traced to the 18th century with the printing of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu's letters from the Turkish embassy. Written from her experiences in the Ottoman Empire as the wife of an English diplomat, Lady Montagu conveyed that women in Turkish harems in some ways, had more rights afforded to them than she did as an English woman. Lady Montagu's observations of the Turkish female fashions were greatly altered after a visit to a Turkish bath. Lady Montagu arrived at the bath and discovered that it was exclusively women, all bathing nude and openly discussing the news of the day. In short, she commented, "'Tis the woman's coffee house, where all the news of the town is told, scandal invented, etc." When Lady Montagu attempted to excuse herself, she was persuaded to not only stay, but also to loosen her stays on her corset, which satisfied them very well, for I saw they believed I was so locked up in that machine that it was not in my own power to open it, which contrivance they attributed to my husband. So these women think that her husband is forcing her to wear this corset. And again, it's sort of funny because of the perspective of what they believed women were like in the harem. Upon her return to England, she wore Turkish-inspired attire as an outward display of admiration for the Ottomans and of the greater freedom the fashion gave her as a woman. And she, of course, would have been sort of seen as an eccentric for wearing it. Women who favored the bloomer costume made a political statement with the fashion by intentionally organizing processions in the Turkish-inspired costume in 4th of July celebrations. And I just want to pause for a second. So 4th of July celebrations, frequently we see individuals trying to make current event political statements on that holiday. And we, to some extent, we of course do that as well in our own modern time, but using the 4th of July or George Washington's birthday, you sort of, this is one time of the year where you're going to have the community coming out. So it's an opportunity to make that statement. And again, trying to connect the 4th of July with this argument, we have to understand that they're clearly trying to associate with this with like independence, right? Wear this and you're going to be more free and independent. One article printed in a medical journal reported that a celebration had taken place in Springfield, Massachusetts on the 4th of July in 1851, where women came together to celebrate an invention which will save thousands from a premature grave. So obviously not painting a very nice picture about corsets. The article continued with a public address. "Ladies and gentlemen, we congratulate ourselves and one another this day, not for deliverance from the British yoke, but from the despotism of a pampered and vitiated appetite and from the death grip of the corset string." Still other examples of women wearing the bloomer costume intentionally on the 4th of July included a group of ladies from Lowell, Massachusetts. Calling themselves the Legion, these ladies made arrangements a full month in advance, so they were planning this for a while, to process on the 4th in, quote, white and in the bloomer costume. So I want to pause for a second there. The fact that they intentionally chose white. So white, of course, is associated with chastity and purity, but it's interesting in that white is eventually going to become the color of the women's rights movement by the early 20th century. And of course, it's still a recognized color associated with that movement. For example, Vice President Kamala Harris at the inauguration intentionally wore white to show that connection. So I think that it's interesting that these women, we see that connection going all the way back to the 1850s. And in Hartford, Connecticut, a 4th of July procession of 31 ladies in the bloomer costume emerged to represent the several states of the Union. Well-known feminists of the day promoted the costume to female audiences. Elizabeth Cady Stanton promoted the fashion in an article printed in The Lily, a temperance and abolitionist newspaper edited by Amelia Bloomer, which was subsequently reprinted in The Liberator. And The Liberator is this important abolitionist newspaper printed by William Lloyd Garrison, who incidentally also was a Philhellene who actually even considered coming to Greece to fight in the Greek army. So interesting connection there. In the article, Stanton asked readers, quote, "A long, full, flowing skirt certainly hangs more gracefully than a short one. But does woman crave no higher destiny than to be a mere framework on which to hang rich fabrics to show them off to the best advantage? Though the bloomer costume was not, quote, generally becoming on all women, the freedom of movement the fashion allowed was at least momentarily popular. So it's sort of funny that they're acknowledging, like, well, the corset and long skirts might look better, and some women's figures just aren't going to look good in the bloomer costume. But hey, it's better for your health to wear it, so please just push forward and wear it anyway. The fashion, of course, proved to be controversial. While for the women who wore the fashion did so primarily for health and freedom, the public perception of the bloomer costume represented a number of taboos. For some, the fashion represented a demand for political equality, as, quote, some of those who advocated the right of suffrage wore the dress. So it's going to be associated with extremely radical women. And again, we have to understand, suffrage for women in the 1850s is very controversial. The women's rights movement officially begins in 1848. So this is in its early stages. Those who wore the fashion were thought to be, quote, strong-minded and advocates of free love and easy divorce. Even though the bloomer costume had disappeared by 1860, its brief popularity represented a surge in female independence and the assertion of women's rights. By donning a style that was associated with Turkish despotism and female oppression, women's rights advocates signaled that their reform efforts would not be demure and accepting of their condition as powers had depicted in the Greek slave. Women's rights advocates would rather insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States, and that's their words. Ironically, women's rights advocates had transformed Turkish oppression into a form of women's liberation. So again, we have to understand that this is part of the Philhellenic rhetoric that had been born out of the 1820s, that you need to support the Greeks because the Turks are despotic and tyrannical, the exact opposite of what's all good and holy here in the United States, so support the Greeks. And now we're starting to see, with the abolitionist movement, people saying, but we have slavery here in the United States, so how do we square that? How can we possibly condemn the Turks for having slaves when we have slaves ourselves? And now we're further seeing the evolution of that argument to discuss women's rights. Suffragettes continued to draw on the rhetoric of the Philhellenic movement in the late 19th century, echoing the critiques reformers had made of the Greek slave. In the 1880s, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Matilda Jocelyn Gage wrote a history of the women's suffrage movement, and in this 3-volume work, they included comparisons to slavery elsewhere in the world to the condition of women in the United States. Just really quickly with these images, so here the women I mentioned. Elizabeth Cady Stanton down here is with her daughter Harriet, who will also later become a women's rights advocate. Quote, American men may quiet their consciences with the delusion that no such injustice exists in this country as in Eastern nations. Yet the same principle that degrades her in Turkey insults her in this republic. Stanton continued that, quote, custom forbids a woman there to enter a mosque or call the hour of prayers. Here, it forbids her a voice in church councils or state legislatures. The same taint of her primitive state of slavery affects both latitudes. In order to more fully understand the impulses women had for public activism in the 19th century, the influence of the Philhellenic movement in the United States must be considered as an important part of that story. The Greek cause and its legacy in American reform reveals both the consensus that first inspired female activism for Greece, as well as the diverging opinions concerning slavery and women's rights. The Greek cause brought together many different women's groups with a range of philanthropic interests, including religious reform, charity for Greek mothers and their children, refugees, and education reform. Women's participation in the Philhellenic movement initially galvanized their involvement in antebellum reform and took female organized benevolence abroad. Though consensus among female organizations did not last, and although not all of the women involved in the Greek cause went on to become radical advocates for abolition and women's rights, the memory of the Greek cause continued to play a pivotal role in 19th century reformist rhetoric. Thank you.
Dear Maureen, thank you very much. And also thank you very much for summing up for us. So I don't have to say too much to sort of respond to your very rich paper and your very rich presentation. You gave us so much. I mean, starting from an image of the harem and sort of going through aid to the Greeks and the refugees and education, women's movement, and then turning the harem and the Turkish pants on its head, and sort of trying to connect it with sort of women activism in the US. We have already questions and I will turn to them. I just wanted to mention that in our new exhibition at the Gennadios Library, both the books of Kastanis and Stefanini are two of the things that we showcase in this little section on the orphans, in quotation marks, but also the fact that indeed sort of education and female education and Emma Willard and the schools in Greece are such an amazing, I think, way to start thinking about this movement and the way that women were thought about, and the aid of American women. I mean, how important it was for the newly founded Greek state. So I start with a question by Nassos Papalexandrou. And this has arrived about sort of 45 minutes ago. So Nassos is asking if the newly founded Greek state kept track of the donations that were coming to Greece, or acknowledged them somehow after the end of the war. Are these gestures commemorated somehow in Greece?
So I do not know if the Greek provisional government kept track of them per se. In fact, from what I've read, I am tempted to say no, but Americans certainly kept track of them. And in fact, initially, before we see the American Philhellenic movement sort of coming into its own, Americans were sending their contributions to the Philhellenic committees in London. And there's much rumbling about that almost immediately, where we don't want to send our money to London. We want to make sure Greece knows we're sending money in our own right. So after about a year or so, there's this concerted effort to have agents from the United States go over to Greece and take the supplies themselves. And then the other part of your question, I think, about like acknowledgement of this. Yes, the Greeks knew that women in particular, in fact, were sending aid. Letters were exchanged between Greek women and American women, and then they were printed in newspapers. So again, like newspapers is this major avenue to get information out. And I came across a number of examples of that, where Greek women are saying, "Thank you so much. Please keep up the good work. We need your help." And then there's one incident that comes to mind where a missionary, and I believe his name's Jonas King, he was in Greece later in the 1820s, I forget exactly which year, something like around 1827. And he finds himself in a little village where the people of the village are very excited that he's American, because they know that the United States has been sending aid, and they're familiar with some of the Americans that are in Greece. And he's invited to a party. And at the party, these Greek locals give a toast to American women who have been sending aid. And according to King anyway, they did a free cheers for American women, and it lasted 5 minutes. And he said he was just really taken aback that they knew that American women had so mobilized efforts, were sending aid. And he writes, and this of course printed in the newspapers too, how proud he was that American women had devoted themselves to this. So.
Thank you very much. I wanted to add that I believe that there is at least one letter of Kapodistrias who is sent to some of the agents that came with one of the 6 ships that came to Greece in 1828, I believe. So there may be more information in the sort of public archives in Greece about that.
Okay.
But so it's important. The next 2 questions are about education. Magdalini Panagopoulou she says, the Greek historian Surmelis, who lived during the revolution, mentions that the students of the Washington School sent to the Greek students a letter expressing their support. The Athenians answered back with a thank you letter on February 20th, 1832. Are you aware of this letter? Which city was the Washington School at? Who was their teacher mentioned as I.K. Rishamdos, Greek pronunciation, Richard, I guess, I don't know. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. So have you heard of that?
No, in fact, as soon as you said Washington School, I thought, oh, I wonder which that would be. Unfortunately, no, but that I would love to find out more information. I will say, I mean, there are a lot of examples of this. Just in you talking about it made me think about, it was a celebration for Washington's birthday. I think it was 1824, so February 1824.
Yes, yes.
And all kinds of children throughout the Washington, D.C. area participated in a parade, and they actually, the children themselves went door to door asking for donations and raised a fairly decent amount of money. So I don't know if maybe it would be from that event or from that area, but thank you for the question. Sorry, I can't be more help.
Rini Papas is asking, do the American schools established in Greece still exist?
So apparently the one does, and Maria, I think you know a lot more about this than I do. And in fact, I was saying before the event started, I would love to look into this more and to look at how long did some of these schools last, because there were a number of them. And a number of students, a lot of teachers came over from the US. And I don't know about the evolution of that, how long they lasted. But again, the one still exists. Yes, that's the Hill School, right?
Yes, if I may answer,
yes,
the school that is now called the Hill Memorial School was founded in 1831 by John Hill and his wife Fanny Newlighan Hill. And it seems to me that, and this is at least what we also say in the exhibition, that after 1837, when support of these schools from the missions in the US sort of stopped, because there was, the Greek Orthodox Church really prohibited catechism unless it was Orthodox catechism. It seems that not too many of these schools remained, and the Hill School seems to be the only one. But it would be worth sort of working on this more.
I have a follow-up question for you then, if I may. So did the Hill School then adopt discussing the orthodoxy then instead of American branded Protestantism?
Well, I don't know if they had to have Greek, catechism,
okay.
But surely they had issues with the mission from the US, and I think that any support stopped. But as I was telling you before, the archives are quite rich, and there's a lot of back and forth and a lot of correspondence. So we will find out more about it.
I would love to find out more.
It seems that for the Philhellenes, the revolting Greeks were racialized as white because they were contrasted with the Orientalized Ottomans. Is that correct? And if so, do you see the racial rhetoric changing over time as Greeks begin to arrive as immigrants in the US? Joanna, I refer to you.
Yes, so great question. Absolutely, yes. And it's actually another aspect that I discuss in my book that I obviously didn't take up today. But yes, the Greeks were absolutely considered white and put on the same level as like the white captives during the Barbary Wars and before. So this is how we see a national consensus in support of the Greek Revolution, and that idea of freeing the Greeks from Turkish slavery. That perspective is derived from this idea that the Greeks are white, and this is, you know, an abomination against nature because whites shouldn't be enslaved by the Turks. And that of course becomes part of the conversation about abolitionism, where abolitionists say, well, are we really going to say that you're only going to support the end of slavery somewhere where it's white slavery, so-called, as opposed to slavery that exists in our own borders just because of the color of their skin? So that becomes part of the abolitionist rhetoric. In terms of how the modern Greeks are going to be perceived as we see immigration really increasing by the end of the 19th century, modern Greeks are of course seen in a different light, and that's it. And I don't touch on that. I don't quite get up that far in my book, and I think it definitely deserves a closer look to look at that evolution more in particular. But Americans supported the modern Greeks through, again, we have to understand their perspective. It's not necessarily reality of how they perceived things going on in Greece, but how they perceived it is how they're going to base their ideas. So the Greeks are associated with classical statuary, like the Apollo Belvedere, that sort of thing, like the perfect idea of the human form at that time. And oh, it's, you know, they're Orthodox Christian instead of the Protestant version that we've got here in the US, and that's okay. It's something we can kind of fix, is sort of what they had in their heads. So I think there's definitely a disconnect about the modern Greeks that they're supporting in the 1820s, and then as they begin to arrive in the late 19th century, because of course they're not perceived in the same way, right? They're not Apollo Belvederes getting off the ships, so.
They're not. I thought we still are.
They didn't think so. Again, it's all about perception.
Christopher Richter, thank you for a fascinating presentation. Did you find evidence of an emerging sense of American exceptionalism emerging and overlapping with the Philhellenism and progressivism?
So certainly American exceptionalism, in the sense that Americans wanted to have influence in regards to the creation of a Greek state. They wanted it to resemble the American Republic. And again, as I already mentioned, it was enough that the Greeks were Christian that they are mobilizing interest to support them. But there's also this underlying, well, but we're going to send missionaries over there to also evangelize on Protestantism as it exists in the United States, because it's just better. And again, it gets into their perspectives on things, right? So yes, in the sense that they're not colonizing in a traditional way. They're not imperial in the traditional way. But as I describe in my book, it's kind of, the United States is sort of like this empire of ideas where they want to insert these ideas into the creation of a new Greek state. And presumably they were likely disappointed that, that Greece does not become a republic. And actually, just as a interesting aside, one of the Greek agents, Jonathan Peckham Miller, has an audience with Alexandros Mavrokordatos, and he says to him, we're only supporting Greece because we expect Greece to become a republic, and we're not going to accept anything less. So if you're not going to be a republic, if you're not interested in becoming a republic, then we're just going to pull the plug. And Mavrocordatos says, sure, Zemo, of course we want to be a republic, even though there were already backroom rumblings of getting the Great Britain to support them. So, so yes, in that sense, American exceptionalism, that Greece has to look like this in order to be totally free. As far as progressivism, I'm not sure if I fully understand that part of the question, but absolutely with American exceptionalism.
I failed to mention, and I'm sorry to our audience and to you, Maureen, but since, I mean, for the past 2 months or a month and a half, your book is also available in Greek. So people who want to get the book fast in Greece, they can get it. It was published by Psychogos, and you know, it's a wonderful thing to have it so fast after you published it in the US, sort of within a few months. So it's wonderful to
too how fast it came out. It has a different title though, I believe. I think it's American Philhellenism or something like that.
Exactly. Well, you know, it's these are marketing issues.
Yes.
And there is a question that sort of brings us closer to the American school. And I know that you have spent some time with our collections, but it may not be fair to you because it will get us to the 20th century. So the question is by Aaron Niles, and he says, during the 1940s, there was an American Philhellenic movement within the context of the effects of Nazi-occupied Greece and Greece's civil war. And Alison France, I mean, a very important archaeologist who was at the American School for many years, is one example of prominent women who were working in cultural heritage in Greece. Was there a strong women's Philhellenic movement specifically within the US with regard to providing aid to Greece in the post-war era? And does it parallel the extent of Philhellenism in the 1820s?
So unfortunately, it's well beyond my focus. That sounds like a lovely secondary project. Should I get into more of the 20th century? I'm somewhat familiar with that, but not enough to, unfortunately, respond to the question in any knowledgeable way.
Okay, I think we have covered quite a bit, and I don't think there are any more questions that have come in. There are comments thanking you for a great and fascinating lecture. I thank you very much for opening up new vistas for us to think about and to think about the relationships of the two countries, and especially from the point of view of women. I do have a final question, and I hope it's not too big. What about Samuel Gridley Howe's wife, Julia Ward Howe? I recently read a book about her in terms of sort of positioning her within the orbit of her husband and the things that she could and could not do. Do you want to comment at all on her involvement with women's rights movements or abolitionism?
You know, so after I'd finished the book, and and it's always like, you do your topic, then afterwards it's like, oh, that would have been really good to have gone more. And I just must confess that I should have done more with Julia, just because I talked so much about her husband, and even I discuss the influence that the Greek Revolution had on Howe's future abolitionist endeavor. I mean, he was very radical and helped sponsor a failed insurrection. So I should have done more with Julia, and I do know that she was a Philhellen, and obviously in the orbit of the same people as her husband. So I will just have to say that I apologize that I did not give her due diligence or attention. So.
Well, on the other hand, I mean, it's you didn't have to, but I was just wondering if she had anything to do with Emma Willard and all these sort of more radical women.
Yeah, not that I came across, but I don't want to say that she didn't, because I know that she was certainly involved with these different groups. I mean, the people that I mentioned all had these family connections. Like Elizabeth Cady Stanton's cousin was a member of the so-called Secret Six, the group of men that financed the failed slave insurrection led by John Brown. Samuel Gridley Howe was another member of the Secret Six. So, all these individuals we have, abolitionists, women's rights advocates, Philhellens, and again, like Julia Ward Howe would have been part of that. And it's something that I do wish that she was in there more.
Well, thank you very much for really opening up a new world and sort of bringing in new names into this Philhellenic endeavor of the Americans. And we hope to see you in Greece. I'm afraid that you may not be here for the exhibition, which is open until the end of December. But we look forward to seeing more of you and to reading your new sort of efforts and endeavors and studies about education in Greece. Thank you very much.
Thank you.